I've been following the Odyssey discussion for a while now, mostly through academics like Mary Beard, Emily Wilson, Daniel Mendelsohn, Victor Davis Hansen. The list could go on. By now, I bet you know the whole world seems to be either defending or fiercely criticizing Nolan's adaptation. At one point, I found myself wondering, the opinions are all over the place, that I could probably assemble a Lego Odyssey out of all these fragments of judgment. But what does Nolan himself think? As a creator, as a subject being discussed and assessed over and over again, how does he understand his own work? That question stayed with me until I watched the recent interview he gave in China with the political philosophy lecturer Zhongshu. What impressed me most was that Nolan's responses can almost be read as a homage to the Odyssey itself, particularly to Homer's masterful use of ring composition. So ring composition is a classic literary technique. It's like traveling in circles only to return to the starting point. In certain episodes, the narration begins from one point, then digresses to an earlier timeline, sometimes even further back, before finally circling back to where it began. Homer plays this trick brilliantly throughout the Odyssey. Daniel Mendelsohn discusses it using the episode where Odysseus' scar is recognized by the old nurse Euryclea. By the way, Mendelsohn is one of my favorite classicists and critics. He published his own translation of the Odyssey last year, and I've just finished reading An Odyssey, a Father, a Son, and an Epic. It's a deeply moving reflection on the relationship between father and son, while offering remarkably insightful ways of reading Homer's epic. I highly recommend his essays and criticism. They are a joyful journey in themselves. Anyways, I'm digressing quite a bit myself, so let's get back to Nolan's interview.
My first question is, does that say something about our age? Are you a bard for a civilization at dusk?
I think it's something that from a modern perspective it's frightening and interesting and intriguing. And I think for me, it partly comes out of having worked on Oppenheimer before this, which is very much a film about the end of the world, about the end or collapse of civilization ultimately. So I think, yeah, I definitely carried that sensibility into this adaptation of the Odyssey.
I first noticed Nolan's own ring composition technique when the second question came up.
I mean, one thing that captured me was that the concept of atonement doesn't exist in Greek culture. It doesn't exist in the Greek language. It doesn't exist in Homer's Odyssey. It exists in your Odyssey. Yeah. So I guess a natural question that I had when watching the film was, did you Christianize the Odyssey? Do you think that atonement, why did atonement become important for the coming of catastrophe?
I think this is a question that many audiences have in mind while watching the film. Nolan doesn't address it directly. Instead, he talks about his fascination with xenia, the Greek concept of hospitality. He explains how xenia, Zeus's secret law of hospitality, still echoes through modern society, and how the narrative of the film is ultimately his contemplation of the consequences of violating that law. Only then does he circle back to the original question. To quote Nolan,
I think the idea of atonement, in a way, is what we bring as viewers to the story. I don't know whether there really is atonement in the film, or whether we just feel that's the catharsis, or that's the process we're seeing in the final meeting that we've waited for between Odysseus and Penelope. But I think in a way, we may be bringing our more modern sensibility to that. But I think it's a very interesting question. And insofar as it's there, it's not a deliberate attempt to, for example, Christianize it, but it's an outgrowth, or it's a natural conclusion of burrowing in on this philosophical idea of what happens when you break Zeus's law.
So Nolan remains somewhat ambiguous, but at the moment I found myself thinking, wow, this is incredibly Odyssean. It's exactly what Odysseus does throughout the epic, using eloquence, indirection, and calibrated ambiguity to navigate difficult situations. What I also appreciate is Zhongshu's persistence. She keeps pressing Nolan on the issue of atonement with the following question.
The connection between atonement, which is the perspective of a Christian world, and xenia, which is the perspective inherent in the Greek world, what connects them is the fact of war. What is the response to war? And you still want to say that the presentation is inherent in the Greek mythological worldview, that war happened when hospitality or xenia is broken.
Yet Nolan makes an even smarter move. Rather than answering directly, he returns to xenia, arguing that it remains one of the foundations of modern civilization, while suggesting that this principle is being challenged on an unprecedented scale today. And we are living through the consequences. Once again, he avoids the question in a literal sense, but implicitly reveals where he stands.
It was one of the things I found is that once you ignore the theological underpinning of xenia, what you realize is that it is what we in modern terms call the golden rule. This idea of treat others as you would be treated has never really changed over time. The reasons that we try to hold people to that might have changed, but the idea itself hasn't changed, because I think we live in a world where the concept of xenia, the concept of mutual respect, is more challenged, I think, than it's ever been, in more obvious ways than it's ever been. And I think we see the negative effects of that in terms of what defines civilization, what binds us together.
Watching this exchange is incredibly satisfying. It's like watching a game of chess, where each move reveals another layer of the player's intelligence. The next fascinating question revolves around the idea of greatness and how Nolan approaches the concept in a way that resonates with contemporary audiences.
We live in an age that demands apology from greatness. Great storytellers, when they portray greatness, Homer celebrates it. We circle around it, we dance around it, we turn greatness into privileges, and we demand apologies for it. That's a fact of Hollywood, and I'm just wondering if, as one of the greatest storytellers of our age, how do you approach greatness? Is it still a story of apology and that demands repentance and reflection and self-criticism?
Again, Nolan first digresses, this time to a broader discussion of narrative mechanics. He makes the sharp observation that recognizing a storytelling mechanism does not invalidate it. I like how he uses this point to express his attitude towards certain kinds of film criticism.
That's a fundamental flaw of film criticism in a way, or storytelling criticism, because to be able to identify the mechanism does not invalidate the mechanism. And that's a real problem in criticism today, because people have this idea that because I can understand why the story affects me the way it is, therefore it didn't work. That's not how storytelling works.
Only afterward does he return to the original question.
The fact that that mechanism is identifiable to people doesn't invalidate it. Part of that mechanism is saying, are we going to treat greatness as an absolute, or coming from a democratic, coming from a more idealized philosophical state that we live in today's world, where we want to view people as equal? Do we have to apologize for that greatness? And the answer is yes, we do, or the audience rejects the greatness. And that is part of the mechanism. My attempt to do that is to retain it within the philosophical surrounding of the breaking of xenia that I have found interesting in the story. So I'm trying to be true to the thematics of the story as I create a character that the audience can invest in and can feel satisfied by.
To me, this is Nolan saying, yes, I may be using traditional narrative mechanisms, but if they work, why abandon them? I find it a convincing argument because he clearly grounds his position as a filmmaker, not as an academic, not as a critic, and not simply as an audience member. Yet with his response, you can sense how deeply he cares about the chemistry between the big screen and the audience. When the conversation moves toward the broader question of how his films communicate across different cultures and social norms, Nolan offers another articulate insight. Every genre has its own common language, a shared narrative mechanism that allows audiences to understand the story. That mechanism forms the foundation, but the ingredients built upon it must constantly evolve to meet the challenging expectations and sensibilities of the contemporary audiences. In other words, the underlying structure remains stable to be universally legible, while everything layered upon it must continue to innovate. He even uses his early film, Memento, as a case study, explaining how he balanced the tradition with innovation.
One of my first films, Memento, was a story that I structured in reverse chronologically. But what I retained was a very, very clear and simple 3-act structure. So the structure of the film as it's received by the audience is very, very conventional, but the chronology is unconventional. And so those are the choices you make. That's one example where you say, okay, I need this to be extremely familiar underneath so that I can change what's on the surface. And that's a continual mechanism that's evolving and that you're working with the whole time.
As a film director myself, I've always been fascinated by the creative process of accomplished filmmakers. So listening to Nolan unpack his own process was an absolute pleasure. And looking back, this entire sequence of questions and answers forms a larger structural ring composition in itself. When the discussion finally returns to the Odyssey, Zhongshu raises another interesting point, that adaptations are often judged more harshly than original screenplays.
I'm again thinking like a nerdy doctoral student who has to write a dissertation. I mean, writing on Plato or Aristotle is the most difficult thing to do. Just like making a film on the Odyssey, it's been done, for thousands of years. And making Memento, you can make it whatever you want. Nobody knows if the character. They won't have a complaint about your adaptive choices. And I'm curious, you've said before, after Oppenheimer, with the success of Oppenheimer, you felt like you've had a kind of liberty to do whatever you want or actualize what you want to do. And you chose the most difficult dissertation to write if you're getting a PhD.
What strikes me is that Nolan seems to have a remarkably clear understanding of how criticism works. His responses rarely linger on a single example or incident. Instead, he constantly shifts the conversation towards larger concepts, broader patterns, and underlying ideas, weighing both their strengths and limitations. That's probably what I love most about this interview.
When you make Memento, yes, it's a character I've created, and people won't criticize it on that, but it's in a tradition of noirish, amnesia-based noir fiction, and people judge it by those terms. So even though on the surface of things, nominally, a film is a different or an original creation, the audience and critics, they tend to judge it in relation to previous examples of the genre, which is an advantage and a disadvantage. But even with an original story, it's the same thing. It's like, well, hang on, why have you used the protagonist in this way? Why has this character done this? Why have they done that? And they're judging it relative to the overall cultural flow of the movement of cinema and the conventions of cinema. And as I say, it's not a complaint. It's because it's just something you have to be aware of as a filmmaker. It's an advantage and it's a disadvantage.
Of course, I have my own criticism as well. For instance, I don't think Nolan gives a very satisfying answer to the final question about the gods. We know that the presence of the gods have been somewhat diluted in the film. When asked about what the gods represent, he says,
what I found interesting about looking at the idea of gods and how to address it, the way I got interested in addressing this from the point of view of people who would have lived in that time, for whom in a pre-scientific era, evidence of divinity is everywhere. And so the existence of gods is not an article of faith, it's simple reality. So thunder and lightning is God speaking to them. The state of the ocean is moved by the gods. They have no other explanation for it. And so just as we accept things from science as absolute fact, the earth is round and we travel around the sun, we can't know these things. We take them as faith because they're presented as facts. The same would be true of the theological structure that explains nature to people of that time. And so for me, the gods are real, but they are inside the people. They are being projected by the people.
To me, the answer feels somewhat self-contradictory or perhaps too nebulous. Then again, maybe the question itself is too complex to be fully addressed within the constraints of a short interview. Still, I found this conversation really rewarding. Just as every digression in Homer's ring composition serves a carefully designed purpose, Nolan's digressions seem equally intentional. Watching the interview a second time, I realized that he isn't simply dodging difficult questions. His detours are strategic. They gradually build the conceptual framework needed to make his argument persuasive. In that sense, Nolan is an extraordinary storyteller, not only in his films, but also in the way he communicates. At this point, I honestly don't care much about the culture wars surrounding the film, the casting debates, the accusations of wokeness, or the endless posts declaring the adaptation shallow. What I do care about is this interview, in which two thoughtful people consciously and respectfully articulate their ideas. That's the kind of content I want to spend my time with. And seeing so many comments praising the quality of the interview also reminded me that people still appreciate conversations built on careful thinking and intellectual curiosity. People still enjoy listening to sharp minds expressing nuanced ideas. And perhaps that's the art of eloquence, and that's the charm of language.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nolan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting conversation.